Hello, everyone. My name is Miss Amber, and I'm here with your English 12B English class for today. Today, we're going to be working on the fourth lesson in Unit 3. We are almost done with the class, and this lesson is about 20th century poetic revolution. So the important things to keep in mind for this lesson are that there's a lot of background information here. So it's kind of beefy in terms of all of the information that you are going to be getting this lesson. However, most of it is just explaining what the different movements are that influence the poetic movement. So since this is going to take a while, prepare, get yourself a glass of water and be ready to be here for a little while taking notes. I will do my best to make sure that we are pretty much covering the major points, but there are actually a lot of major points to go over in this lesson. So if you are having issues with understanding things, please be reminded that you can schedule tutoring with either myself or Miss Kathy Vahovic, and we'll get back to you ASAP to go through this lesson. Most of the reading selections are shorter poems. So there are going to be a lot of reading selections in here, but they won't be very long. And since this is modernism and it takes place after World War I, most of it will be in English that's closer to what we speak today. So there shouldn't be too much issue with you understanding what everyone is talking about or what the excerpts are saying. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and jump into sharing my screen. All righty. So we're starting on slide number 5 about the modernist movement. And even though there's only 3 paragraphs here, there's a lot of information. So we'll just jump right in. They give you the information at the beginning that modernism is a 20th century movement. Now, just to remind people who may be watching videos for the first time or who may not be sure how things work, or you may have forgotten, the trick to figuring out what century someone is talking about, how that translates to in years, is you take the number they've given you. So in this case, it's 20th. So the number 20, you subtract 1, that will give us 19, and then you add double zeros. So the 20th century is the 1900s. So they're telling you that modernism is a movement that was basically popular during the 1900s, especially the early 1900s. Saying all of this to say, this first sentence tells you that even though this is a movement that took place in the 1900s, hints of it emerged during the Victorian era. So that's the 1800s. And they give you examples of authors that are considered early modernists. So they give you Thomas Hardy and A.E. Housman. So even though they both wrote at the peak of the Victorian era, they had features in their writing that pretty much had a lot of the characteristics of modernism. So when people write, the explanation for this is they're influenced by different things. And because you can see how the influences change over time, occasionally you can see hints of what the next movement is going to be. Think about like TV, for example, the types of stories that we make into movies these days. You pretty much can take a look at what's popular at the time and sort of make an educated guess about movements and where they started. So for example, there are a lot of fantasy books that get made into movies these days, but there were a few of those that popped up in the 1990s. For example, The Matrix was based off of a book. And just because you can see peaks of it here or there, you can sort of follow the breadcrumbs into what led into it being accepted and being considered popular. And it's the same thing for writing. So you can see hints of modernism in these two gentlemen's work, Thomas Hardy and A.E. Housman. And that's sort of the hint that you get during the Victorian era about influences that'll end up shifting how people write in the 1900s. So in the second paragraph, they let you know that modernism was the dominant force in art and literature. And we already have read about modernism, especially in war literature from the last lesson. So this is more covering the artistic side and how that affected poetry, because poetry is a little more artistic than just writing stories. So it says here, in the broadest sense, Modernism was an artistic reaction to the grim state of the modern world, which we know because we studied the war literature last lesson. It was especially influenced by the war, which left cities in ruins and devastated the European economy. So they're showing you how this is connected. Advances in photography and war journalism brought harrowing images to people who lived far from the battlefield. So that means that people were moved by the images that they saw and just couldn't believe what war looked like from the front lines. And it says here that the widespread destruction, people being informed about that destruction, coincided with a burst of artistic creativity. And then they give you examples of this. Painters, sculptors, architects, and writers experimented with artistic boundaries and questioned the very definition of art. So that's sort of a summary of what we're going to get into today in terms of modernism and how art affected what poetry was like at the time. Now we're moving on to slide 6. Slide 6 covers a different side of things. So we know the sort of social influences that existed at the time, but during the 1900s, we were also having a lot of advancements in scientific stuff as well. Like if you remember, we were talking about in the last lesson how World War I affected the soldiers who came back, because even though people were able to survive their war injuries, they still had to deal with the psychological effects of things. And we had to deal with a lot of basically just trying to look at what PTSD was and how it affected people and how that was connected to war. So this page is basically about the science that influenced the artistic movement during this time. It says here, the following academic theories were particularly instrumental in the development of modernism. Now, they give you 3 theories here, the ones that were most important. So there's Max Planck's quantum theory in 1900. So his theory pretty much formed the basis of modern physics. And because he basically discovered or was able to prove the existence of the atom, right? And figuring out the nature of energy and the smallest particles known to man at that time. And people were amazed to discover that objects that they thought were solid and fixed were actually rapidly moving particles. So they were basically realizing that everything is made out of atoms, neutrons, protons, that kind of thing, and that they were just very tightly packed together and moving in such a small way and in such a quick speed that we're not able to perceive it personally. Now, the next one is Einstein's theory of relativity in 1905. His theory challenged concepts that people thought were true as well. So this important treatise explained that gravity affects the shape of space and the flow of time. And then at the bottom, we have Sigmund Freud's interpretation of dreams. Now, most people, when they think of Sigmund Freud, they think of the subconscious. And that's because he basically studied a lot of the events that affect people from their childhood to their adulthood. That's pretty much what he's known for. And he introduced in this book, The Interpretation of Dreams, the words that we are familiar with when we talk about the subconscious today. So the unconscious, that's what our instincts tell us to do, the things that we don't quite think, but that we almost sort of feel underneath our thoughts. And then also the ego, which is our sense of self, what we consider ourselves to be, and the id, which is our human baseline instincts. And then it says here, Freud devotes most of his work to the hidden and irrational aspects of the human personality. So the things that we can't see beneath the surface of our thoughts, like I said earlier. So these things also influenced modernism. Changing the way that people think about things often changes the way that they make art. Okay, so on this slide, there is a video about modern art. So it's going to go over some of the different styles of art and some of the different artists that pioneered those types of art movements. This video is only 3 minutes and 15 seconds. So take a moment to actually watch this and then meet me back on slide 8 and we'll go into a little more about modernist poetry. Now, it's actually important to watch this video and pay attention because some of the words that are used in this video from art transfer over into how people apply things to poetry. Very often, people will try to take the art movements that are happening at the time and figure out what is the written version of this. So that's why art and poetry are so closely connected. So take a moment to watch this, pause the video, watch this, and then meet me back at slide 8 when you're ready. Okay, welcome back. So this slide, number 8, is about relating modernist poetry to art, pretty much, and giving you an idea of what some of the aspects of poetry at this time was. So in the last video, they talked about how modernist painters broke tradition and challenged assumptions about art and what it was supposed to be. And like I said earlier, those sort of ideas often transfer over to poetry, and this is not an exception. So poets tried to break with traditional forms too. Now it says here that poetry was no longer bound by traditional notions of rhyme, meter, and scansion. So I want to stop and explain each of these and give you a refresher in case it's been a little while since you've actually read about this. So we have rhyme. Rhyme is when you have a regular rhyme scheme. Sometimes the rhymes go together in pairs. So you'll have 2 lines that rhyme one way, and then you'll have 2 lines that rhyme with another sound, and you'll go back and forth. Sometimes you'll have a pattern where every other line rhymes with each other. And there are other patterns too. But modernist poetry was like, no, we're not doing rhyming. We're not trying to do patterns. Meter here, meter has to do with the types of syllables that you choose, stressed and unstressed. So usually there's a pattern in traditional poetry. So you'll have something like a pair of syllables. One will be stressed and the second will be unstressed. Excuse me. And the pattern that they're in, so say you have stressed and unstressed repeating 3 times, that would be a basically iambic trimeter. So the pattern of a stressed and unstressed syllable, and then you have it repeat 3 times. That's the type of thing that would happen in traditional poetry. They had rules for the types of words you could pick and the types of sounds, the syllables in the word had and what order they were in, and how many times they're repeated. And scansion is the art of being able to look at a poem, to break it down into separate syllables, and then figure out what the pattern is. So modernists were just like, we don't want to go by those rules. The world is different. We're trying to make something that reflects the times that we're in. We're not in the old classical times anymore, so we don't want any more old classical style poetry. So of course, a lot of people did not like this. Literary critics had a lot to say about these new trends. Many did not like the experimental approach of the modernists, and some critics denounced modernist poetry as lazy. Others accused modernists of ignoring centuries of tradition. So basically there was some pushback, and some people just thought, oh, well, you just don't want to learn the rules, or you're not smart enough to learn the rules to write real poetry. And other people just said, okay, listen, so I know you want something new, but the people that we come from have done it this way. And it's weird to suddenly change it up now for no reason, especially when those ways are tried and true and there's an art form to them. But some people did actually see that modernism was being done on purpose. So people were not ignoring tradition. They were specifically rejecting it. They were very specifically saying, the world is different. So our art needs to be different to reflect the world that we're in. And we're not going to do things the old way anymore, because the old ways of writing applies to the old ways of living. And in the times we're in, post World War I and such, this doesn't reflect the type of lives that we are living now. So it says here, These critics recognized that this brand of poetry required a new analytical perspective, and they began looking through a new lens and thinking about what poetry could be. And that was kind of one of the points of modernism, just pointing out, obviously things have not turned out the way that they should for us as humans. So why don't we take a look at what poetry can be instead of what it used to be? Things turn out differently sometimes, and it's important for our art to reflect those experiences. So here at the bottom, we've got that modernist poetry also brought a new set of perspectives about poetry. We have locating the meaning in the viewpoint of the individual rather than some larger truth. I'm going to stop to explain that one. So in books previously, usually telling a story had a point. There was a moral, there was a lesson, there was a message. And usually the author was using the story to try to teach people about what they thought about an issue. That was the point of a piece of writing. But modernist poetry pretty much thought, or at least posed the question of, what if it's not about a bigger lesson? What if instead it's about showing you life through the eyes of someone whose life you would never know regardless? So this is kind of like an offshoot of the realism movement. So like, instead of using real life to show you a lesson, sometimes it's just about understanding how other people think and live and how they interact with things. The second one, focusing on poems as an exploration of the inner self through perception and knowledge. So this one is just using poems as reflection. And there have been reflective poems before, but this is kind of a little more like in a raw way. Like you get to see the poet's discussion with themselves while they're trying to sort things out, in the hope that someone can see that, identify with it, and maybe find some of themselves in the other person as well. The next one is believing that the very essence of poetry was to suggest and not to offer complete statements or all-encompassing judgment. So this is related to this first point. So instead of believing that every story had to be pushing just a single point of view or trying to convince you of something, modernist poets felt like the essence of poetry was to just give you the suggestion of something. Hey, here's another perspective. Maybe at least consider thinking about it from this viewpoint. And that was something that people hadn't really been doing in poetry. They just assumed that poetry was, here's my point of view, or here's the point of view that I want to push. Here you go. This is what it is. Either you agree or you don't agree. But modernists came in and said, like, well, maybe the point of poetry as art is to just sort of show you something new. Maybe it won't change your thoughts. Maybe it won't, change your life. But the point is to give you the idea of something you hadn't considered before. And maybe you can use that knowledge in the future while you're interacting with other people. And then this last one is believing that each reader could be affected differently by the same poem. Again, older works were kind of caught up in the idea that there was only one way to interpret something. Your goal was to try to figure out what the author meant, and you were either right or you were wrong. But the modernist movement recognized how differently things feel and are to different people. So the goal was to sort of show the perspective and let people get out of it what they happen to get out of it. This was where the idea that art is a collaborative work where the artist puts out something and then the person reading or seeing it adds their own interpretation to things that makes it deeper. Before this point in time, people did not read like that. That was not the strategy for reading. Alrighty. On slide 9, we've got some more factors of modernist poetry. So they say the key aspect of modernist poetry is the experimental form. And that's what we were talking about earlier, about not using rhyme or meter, those kind of patterns. They used a lot of free verse, which is basically when things don't have a pattern. That's pretty much what that is. And then they talk about minimal language. Another common characteristic of modernist poetry is minimal language, which can be identified by the following features. So this is a list of what makes up minimal language. So we're going to go through these. So we have using common language, and that's instead of flowery or wordy speech. So instead of trying to describe what the sun's rays feel like in 16 different words, people just wanted to use everyday common language that the average person could understand. The second one is holding that the form and language in a poem is art in and of itself. So basically, the words that you choose to put in a poem is not about being sophisticated. It's not about being fancy. It's not about seeming smart. It's the emphasis on these words were picked on purpose, and the words that you picked on purpose is a part of the art. It's not just the meaning of the poem that's art. It's also the words that you pick. That's a part of it too. Carefully focusing on symbols and vivid imagery. Now we go into what symbolism is in just a little bit. But basically the long story short is when you use ideas or objects to represent an idea, that's what a symbol is. So for example, like the biggest example that I could use is when people see the eagle, that's like the American national bird, they think freedom, right? So obviously the bird doesn't mean freedom, but because America heavily associates itself with the idea of freedom, and that is our national, like bird, the two have like come together to be representative of each other. Usually if you see the eagle, you think freedom. And vivid imagery here is just being able to picture something very clearly. If something is vivid, it's usually bright, colorful, it stands out. And imagery is the description of things using the descriptors for the senses. So seeing, hearing, touching, smelling. So vivid imagery, put those two words together, it's basically bright, stark, noticeable language that can give you a picture of things. This next point is stressing economy of language using few words. So economy of language, they basically give you the definition of it here. It's using few words. Try to remember that economics is like the study of how people spend and circulate money. So economy of language is how people use or don't use words. So the idea behind modernism was to say as much as you can in as few words as possible. And then this last one is leaving behind the literal meanings of words in exchange for figurative language. So basically trying to emphasize that there are comparisons that can be made with your language instead of the literal meaning. So an example of figurative language, and this gets mentioned a little further down, is a metaphor. So if I were to say, her eyes are the sea, I'm comparing someone's eyes to the sea. And you have to think about all the connections that can be made. When you think of the sea, what do you think of? You think of water. Water is usually blue, so this person's eyes are probably blue. The ocean or the sea is deep, right? It stretches all the way down to the Earth's crust, right? So perhaps you're also trying to symbolize that this person's eyes, you can just like stare and get lost in. Maybe it's a specific color of blue. It's a deep blue color and not a light blue color, since you're using the sea and not the sky to describe the color. So basically that's an example of figurative language. It's instead of using words to just mean literally what you're saying, everything has sort of like a hidden meaning, and you have to dig into the poem to think, oh, well, why would he pick this specific word? What kind of features are they implying as a part of what they're trying to say? Now down here, it says, here are some kinds of figurative language commonly found in modernist poems. So they go over this just so that you have an idea of what you'll be encountering when you read the excerpts. Now we have symbolism. We did kind of go over that. It's recurring, so that means it happens over and over, and unexpected uses of terms that stand for something else. So for example, we had the freedom eagle, right? So the eagle clearly can't mean freedom. And even if we're used to hearing it, like someone who doesn't live in the US would be like, okay, but the eagle is just a bird. Like, why does that mean freedom? And there are reasons for that. You can explain the connections, when eagles can fly, they can go wherever they want, relatively. So that's like the idea of freedom wrapped into the package of like animal symbolism, right? But to someone who just thinks, oh, well, flying is what birds do, they wouldn't necessarily associate it with freedom unless you explain it. So that's the important thing about symbolism. When you're digging and you see something that's, a comparison that's being made and you're not sure, you have to think about the features and see the connections. Allusions are classical allusions. So classical allusions to Greek culture and mythology. So I'm going to explain what allusions are really quickly. Allusions are references to popular content or media in a book, a movie, a television show. So, for example, when people reference God in a book, they're referencing the Bible. They're making a biblical allusion. Most people know what the Bible is. Even if you're not religious, you know what it is. A lot of people know some of the stories in the Bible, even if they are not familiar with like the details. So when you make references to those sort of things in a story, things that were popular or that are well known, that's what an allusion is. Now, in this case, modernism has classical allusions to Greek culture and mythology. So, for example, you might find a reference to Zeus or a reference to Hercules, and they'll mention it without giving you any explanation because they assume that it's so popular and well known that you'll pick up on what the meaning is. And then this last one here is unconventional. That means different from what society would expect. Unexpected or bizarre metaphors, similes, and personification, replacing the established metaphors of their predecessors. So metaphors are when you compare two things. Similes are when you compare two things using like or as. So just as a quick revisit to my example from earlier, her eyes are the sea is a metaphor. You're comparing eyes and the sea, and you're saying that somehow they're similar. If you were to make this into a simile, you would use the words like or as. That is the only difference between a metaphor and a simile, the use of the words like or as. So for example, if I were to say her eyes were like the sea, that would be a simile instead of a metaphor because I use the word like. That's it. That's the only big difference. It's important to remember that. It seems like such a small thing, but on a test, it can definitely be the difference between you getting a point and you not getting a point. A personification is when you give something that is not alive human characteristics to describe them. So for example, if I said something like the trees are dancing in the wind. Trees obviously cannot dance. That's not a thing that they can do. But since I said they are dancing in the wind, what I'm trying to say is give you a picture. I'm basically giving you a picture of how the trees are moving. They're moving in a way that makes it seem like they are dancing because of the way that the wind is blowing. So that's personification. And this last section, it just says replacing the established metaphors of their predecessors. So basically, there are certain comparisons and metaphors that were popular in older times. And the point of bringing this up is that the modernists basically said those metaphors are old and people already know what they are. They're cliche. So we want to come up with new associations to certain things that work a lot better and that fit the sort of time that we're living in. So think of how, for example, we'll use like a very cheesy saying, don't judge a book by its cover is something that everyone is familiar with, right? It's a way of saying, don't judge someone by how they look. So the modernists would look at a line like this and say, cool. So we Books are very popular. They're a thing that people enjoy reading and stuff. But now we do movies, now we do radio, now we do TV shows. So we need to come up with a different way of saying the same thing that people can recognize and have that association with. That's pretty much what they did with metaphors. They took some of the old comparisons and just decided that they wanted something that matched better with the times they were living in. And they decided that they were going to do something new. Now at the bottom, they give you actually an important part. They give you typical modernist themes. So there's a short list. I'll go through them real quick. So basically, typical modernist themes include the question of experience. So what is real? Is this real? Are we in a huge shared dream or nightmare or hellscape? The loss of meaning in the modern world. So remember, we're talking about all of the loss that's happened after World War I. We're in the lost generation. So many people have died. What are we here for? What are we throwing our lives away for? We've got the search for meaning in a world without God. Some people lost their faith during this. They figured or thought that God wouldn't allow something like this to happen to human beings if he were real. So in some works just question the idea of a person who's going through that. So you might have an author writing about like a soldier who saw such terrible things in war. They were just like, how could God exist in a world where something like this could happen? There's also the critique of traditional values. So we kind of went over that. The things that older people and societies felt were important, and is it actually still important in modern times? And the search for self. So figuring out who you are, what you're here for, what the point of your existence is. Alrighty, I'm gonna hop over to slide number 12. That's where the next section begins. Okay, so we're here on movements within modernism. So there were small movements that were a part of the modernism movement that had emphasis on different sections of modernism. Now, what I want to tell you just ahead of time is that there are 3 of these movements, and they all have a bit of information that you're going to have to jot down, but I will try to get through it as shortly as possible. So the first one is the Imagist movement, and they talk about Ezra Pound because Ezra Pound is known as the person who basically founded the Imagist movement. The first school that they go into, the first school of sub-movement within modernism, is the Imagist movement. So it's a movement that's based on Chinese and Japanese poetry, and it emphasized clear, that means easily understandable, and concise, that means short and to the point, language and striking imagery. Now, we already talked about vivid imagery and economy of words on the last page. So this is part of where that came from. And the Imagist movement just looked at other cultures to see who did it first and took inspiration from that. So in this case, it was Chinese and Japanese poetry. Now, the important things to know is the origin of it. We've got that right here. It lasted roughly from 1909 to 1918 in both Britain and the US. So it was very popular to cross over the ocean into British society as well. And then we have here that Imagism was the first organized sub-movement of modernist poets. And I mean, it started early on, so it makes sense that this was the first in 1909. Now, the point of Imagism was to reject flowery language and cliched sentimentalism of the romantic and Victorian poetry. Now, we talked about that just on the last slide, trying to get away from the sort of things that the pretty and beautiful things that we've heard over and over. So they focused on using language sparingly. And the point was to give people an image, a vivid image in their head in as few words as possible, in exact detail. So they didn't want any words sort of like stretching out a sentence. They were like, so what is the best way that I can use words to get people to picture this exact feeling or setting or person? So it says here, imagists strove to find that sometimes elusive exact word in their poems that express their thoughts. It's like if you've ever been writing something, trying to write someone a text message or send them a voicemail, and you're like, oh, I have the word that describes my feeling right on the top of my, like the tip of my tongue, off the top of my head. I'm so close, but I can't figure it out. I know that there's just one word to describe what I'm trying to put here, but I can't figure it out. So the images were basically this sort of group that was like, we need to always try to find those exact words that express what we're trying to say and only use those words. Don't waste time trying to describe what we're trying to describe. It's your job to find the perfect combination for showing people what you want to show them. So at the bottom, just a summary. Imagists were also devoted to clarity of expression through use of precise visual images. So again, we're talking about precision. Okay. So at the top here, it says here that like other modernists, imagists favored experimental, non-traditional verse. And then they give you a list of some famous imagists. So well-known imagists, we've got Hilda Doolittle, and she usually signed her name as HD. And we have F.S. Flint. But the figurehead of imagism was Ezra Pound, and that's why they mentioned his name in the subtitle for this section. So we're going to get a bunch of information about Ezra Pound since he was the focus in the center of imagism. So Ezra Pound was a US citizen that had tremendous influence on Great Britain. He was born in Idaho in 1885, but moved to London later. He had a venturesome, so that means he traveled a lot, both physically and within his thoughts. Erratic mind that continually strived to perfect his poetry. So he was obsessed with trying to become the perfect poet. And he thought that there was a poetic perfection that could be reached, and that imagism was the key to achieving it. So he thought that the perfection, the perfect form of poetry was to be able to express as much in as few words as possible. And he thought it was possible to write like the perfect poem that does exactly that. No extra words, no extra descriptions, no extra feelings, just that one specific moment put into words. And he thought that poetry's purpose was to achieve an intellectual and emotional experience in a brief amount of time through the description of an image, which lines up pretty much with what imagism is. And he's quoted as saying that the image was an emotionally charged idea that occurred in an instant of time. So basically, the point of poetry was to give you that quick emotional and intellectual experience in that brief amount of time. So no reading for 3 hours to try to get through an epic poem and figure out the point. The goal of poetry should be to just create a vivid image in a moment, basically a picture in words. That's the entire point of the imagism movement. Now on slide 14, we talk about some of his influences in his career. It says here, he incorporated Vorticist ideas into imagism. Now, Vorticism is something from the art realm. So it refers to abstract developments in art. So basically, different ways to create an abstract image. So like, an abstract image is a picture of something that doesn't, it's almost like shapeless. It's trying to put a big idea into a visual form. So for example, if you were to take the word truth, how would you show someone a picture of what the truth is, right? It's a picture of like the idea of truth. The idea behind being abstract is to find a form that people can say like, yeah, that kind of reminds me of how this makes me feel. That's what abstractism is. So he took the vorticist idea of spatial form. Spatial form has to do with how things are spaced out, clarity, and definite outline, and applied them to the written word of poetry. Now, obviously, clarity is being able to see something clearly, and definite outline is being able to literally show the outline of a shape with like crisp clearness. So looking at what imagism is, which is taking that small movement and just trying to define it so that someone gets the perfect snapshot in words, it makes sense that he took these ideas and put them into his poetry, because that's basically what the imagism movement is. And it says here, for nearly 50 years, Pound worked on his poetic masterpiece, the Cantos. And he published bits of it throughout his career. So the end result, though unfinished, is an epic poem of 120 sections, or cantos. So he basically took these small images that he was perfecting and put them together into a large poem. So each section is supposed to give you a sharp image, and those images are supposed to be associated with each other throughout the whole work. And even though it's unfinished, it's pretty much a journey through his mind. The Cantos is a journey through one of the era's most fertile minds. Okay, and on this last slide, we're going to get a little more information about Pound's life and an example of imagism from him. So basically, we talked about how Pound is controversial here. So it wasn't just him trying to redefine what poetry was, but he also did a couple odd things that people didn't quite understand. So during World War II, he helped broadcast fascist ideas to the United States, and he was charged with treason. But he was actually declared mentally unfit to stand trial. Basically, a jury ruled to sort of overlook his politics because his poetry was so popular and he did so much for the artistic scene. So they didn't convict him, and they just sort of let him move away eventually. So he moved to Italy, and that's where he ended up dying. And then at the end, they tell you that even though the Imagist movement was over by 1917, Imagist ideas about poetry influenced free verse poets. So basically, the idea of taking that crisp, clear picture and putting it into words, even though it wasn't super popular after 1917 and the movement was over, the idea of doing that, of having that crisp, clear picture, influenced other poets through the 1900s. So then they give you an example of vivid Imagist poetry. So notice this is literally a poem with 2 lines, and it's very short. So this is an example of Imagist poetry. This is by Ezra Pound, and it's called In a Station at the Metro. The poem is: the apparition of faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. So then they explain how it actually is a part of the station, how the station of the metro is an example of Imagism. It says, this simple, straightforward poem fits Pound's description of Imagism. In 19 words, including the title, he paints a simple picture of faces at a metro station as ghostly flower petals on a black bough, perhaps wet from the rain. So they want you to keep in mind that he struggled over every word that he used here. He is comparing the faces in the crowd to petals on a bough. If you've ever seen like a thick branch with petals on it, if you've ever stared at it, maybe with your eyes unfocused, it can appear similarly to faces in a crowd when you pass them. He wanted to get the exact word in the right spot to evoke the precise image he had in mind. Now on slide 16, we get a little more explanation about this poem. Pretty much, if you've ever been to a subway station, you get an idea of the ghostly faces. You pass by lots of people, but you don't really see them. You don't quite look at them. Their faces don't actually come into focus unless you choose to concentrate on them. So all of these faces are supposed to be connected by the branch or the bow of the subway train. And that's why he's making the comparison. But also keep in mind that one of the important things about modernism is that you're supposed to be able to get your own interpretation out of it. So it says here, the beauty of many modernist poems is that there's rarely one interpretation. One way to think about this, for example, is to view it as a comment on relationships between strangers. They point this out. That's another meaning that this poem could have. The petals on the flower receive their nourishment from the same stem. So that's the bough. Each petal is a distinct entity. So each petal on the tree is its own living thing, but it's also linked to everyone else on the bough, just as people around the world are connected to each other. And technically, people who are catching the train are all connected by the transportation that they're taking. So the point is that this poem captures a moment in time on a subway and illustrates Pound's poetic talent and commitment to imagism, the precise words. Now here they give you a picture of people in the subway, and then they give you the poem so that you can sort of compare this to the image and see what you think about if it is actually, if you can see the connection. Okay, I am going to encourage everyone to take a break here. We are through half of the slides, but we still have quite a bit to go. We have the two other schools of modernism that are left, and then we also have some other readings that we have to do. So go ahead and pause the video, take a sip of water, get a snack, and then come back, okay? All right, so we're on slide 17. And this is the second of the three schools of modernism. This is the symbolist movement. So this one actually has, I think, the shortest explanation. So we'll try to get through this a little quickly. So they give you the broad definition of symbolism at the beginning. We did go over it a little earlier, like the example of the eagle to represent freedom. But the official definition they give you here is the use of one object to suggest or represent another object. In literature, it's the extensive use. Remember the word recurring from earlier. So it has to show up over and over again in a text. So they give you the history behind this movement. It began in France in the late 1800s. And it was founded by a French poet whose name is Charles Baudelaire. The movement peaked in the 1890s, but obviously it influenced some things that happened in the 1900s as well. So here, the symbolists rejected the stark everyday subject matter of realists and naturalists because realism was important at the time. And symbolists wanted to be a little more romantic in their outlook, a little more positive. And they just wanted to have a little more like layered meaning instead of everything being straightforward. So they preferred multifaceted symbolism. So like, again, the layers and rich, dark imagery. And it says here, I wanted to acknowledge this because you guys aren't the only ones. Symbolist literature can be confusing. So for example, many symbolist works contain symbols layered in patterns. However, the symbols usually don't have any logical relationship to one another. So what they're basically saying here is they understand that it's a difficult topic and that when you have one thing representing another thing, it's kind of difficult to understand unless you pick it apart. So for example, we all associate hearts with love now, right? But the only reason why we do that is because in books and literature, we've seen so many times, feelings and emotions are associated with the heart, even though all the heart does is pump blood through our veins, right? But since we've seen the comparisons between hearts, feelings, and love so much, hearts have come to symbolize the idea of love. Even though technically love is something that happens in the brain, you see a person or you bond with them and your brain releases certain chemicals, you become attached to them. We don't associate it with the brain, we associate it with the heart. So the ways that symbolism can affect society are pretty big. When you see the same stuff over and over again, you tend to associate it with the concepts that they're connected to, even if they don't actually have a real relationship. So they know here that symbolism is not just about style. It's a philosophical outlook too. They were interested in psychology, and that has to do with how the brain can associate certain things, certain ideas with certain objects. That's the root of symbolism. And it's really not focused on the surface world. It's more like the subconscious. And that's how we get the connection to, for example, like Sigmund Freud that we mentioned earlier. Symbolism has more to do with how the things that we see and hear and grow up with can come to be symbols in our own lives and how we associate ideas and feelings with things, even if no one else associates those feelings with those things. So it also, deals a little bit with the sort of underlayer and the deep and the subconscious impulses is what it says here. They focus on the deep and subconscious impulses of the human mind. So basically, it's the human mind works to actually make those sort of associations because it's easier to remember things when you have associations to them in your head. If you picture, for example, I would say something like, if you associate a boat with water, because boats are normally on the water, it helps you remember that boats are made to sail on the sea. But to someone who's never seen a boat, it will be harder for them to make that connection, right? Now, those are connections that we make in our brain without thinking about it because they make things easier to remember. Now, it says here, according to symbolist theory, the true core of literature and all art for that matter existed in each reader's unique interpretation and response. So again, this is the things that we as individuals associate with what happens in a book. The associations you might have with someone, a character, a place, an object in a book might be different from someone else if they had a different childhood upbringing, or just different things happened to them when they grew up. At the time, knowing this and incorporating it into your work was groundbreaking. So people just thought, oh, there's only one meaning to everything. And symbolism came in and said, like, no, that's different things mean different things to different people. So it makes sense for everyone to have a different interpretation of things. And that's what art is. Art is actually everyone looking at the same thing and getting something different out of it. And in the late 1800s, people were like, oh my God, what do you mean? You mean there's no right way to look at art? And the symbolists are like, no, there isn't a right way to look at art. And this is where that section of modernism comes in terms of recognizing individual viewpoints and sometimes just showing them just to show them. This is where that comes from. Alrighty. And this is the last section, at least so far as the modern movements go. We got a little bit more to go through in this tutorial, but we'll try to get through it. So new criticism is basically a movement that focuses on the way that we look at skill and art and how those things mix together. So we talked about it a little earlier in terms of some critics actually understanding that modernism was rejecting traditional stuff on purpose. So this is a movement that actually focused on, let's take a look and figure out how we're looking at things and if we're doing it the right way. So new criticism pretty much came out at the same time as modernism, imagism, and symbolism. So this is just like part of it overall. And the importance of new criticism was to question the importance of capturing an author's reason for writing a work. So again, just to reiterate and remind you, classical and traditional writing meant that it was important to figure out what the author was trying to say. What was the reason why this was written? And using that as the judgment for if something was meaningful or good or bad. Now, New Criticism wanted to do something different. They instead wanted to emphasize close attention to the textual elements. So they basically said the reason why someone writing this isn't what makes it good. What makes it good is if it actually does what it's trying to do really well. It focused on the qualities of a work that caused it to provoke emotional responses in readers. So did they build this upright? Does this character serve the purpose of getting the attention of the reader throughout the story? Are we feeling for this character? Are we going to be sad if they die? How do they build that up? What methods do they use? Is it effective? And that's the sort of critiques that we use today when we look at books. And it's important to realize that people didn't always think the same way about the point of reading or writing or art. So it wasn't actually popular at first. This is almost exclusively how we look at stuff these days. But at the time, this was new and people just felt like it was artistically and morally bankrupt. They were just like, so how are you just going to disregard the author's point? How are you not going to associate the work with what the author thinks? And they just felt like they felt like it was disingenuous to judge a work based on what was actually written and not the prestige of the person writing it in their opinion. Now, here in the second paragraph, we go into some of the important figures and establishing events for New Criticism. So in 1941, John Crowe Ransom published his first influential book on New Criticism. And it was called New Criticism. So it basically became the manual for this school of criticism. It was a guide for how to actually look at things. And his theories were influenced by the philosophies of early 20th century artists and critics. So he basically took different points that people had made separately and sort of combined them together and said, like, okay, this is what New Criticism is about. Here's all the information, all in one place. So his main focus was on British writers from the 1930s, and he used those works as examples and that kind of thing. So particularly, he focused on T.S. Eliot, I.A. Richards, and William Empson. And to strengthen this movement, Ransom's book was followed by two influential essays, and these were written by William Wimsatt and Monroe Beardsley. And these two people introduced the terms intentional fallacy and affective fallacy. So I'm going to give you the definition of those because I know this is a lot of information. So intentional fallacy is basically, it refers to what these critics saw as the error of considering an author's intention while analyzing a text. So basically, they're saying, let the work speak for itself. Don't include what the author's intention was. It doesn't actually matter what their intention was. What matters is what they actually managed to do. If you give the author too much credit by considering what they wanted versus what they did, you're not actually critiquing the work. You're critiquing the idea of the work. So what you need to do is actually critique what they wrote, not what they were trying to write. And affective fallacy refers to the influence of a reader's emotional response on the analysis of a text, which they consider unreliable. So basically, the second one, the affective fallacy, is the critique isn't about how the book makes you feel. It's about what the book actually does well. So just because you don't like something or you think something is great doesn't mean that it was done well. There has to be a standard for what is something done well and what is something done badly. And that's how you should judge a work instead of looking at your feelings. So pretty much, new criticism is a protest against conventional ways at the time of looking at art and literature. And that's influenced even today. Some critics concentrate on the literary work as an object itself. So they pull away the author and just say, but what does the piece say? What does the piece do? And they think that literature exists on its own and not for what it accomplishes. So basically, because everyone has their own viewpoint in terms of how something makes them feel, when you're critiquing a work, it's not about how it makes you feel, because it might make someone else feel differently. It might make 15 different people feel differently. It's actually about just what the text does on its own. And then they give you an example of this. So I'm going to read out the example because I'm hoping that this example will kind of put things together for you if my explanation hasn't helped. So it says, for example, philosophical, so that means about how people think, and scientific writing serve the purpose of expressing a message. So usually if you're writing about how people think, or if you're writing about science, you're actually trying to tell people something, like we've done research and this is what we're trying to let you know. We're trying to tell you what the research has said. In the same way, traditional critics might say that a novel is meant to communicate a story. That's what traditionalists would say. They would approach it the same way that they would approach a science report and say, this book is meant to communicate a story. So that's what it's trying to do. But new criticism claims that readers find value and worth in the actual literary work itself. So basically, the point of criticism was saying, new criticism is saying, literature is not just a message, right? It's not just telling you, oh, we did some experiments and found out that the sky was blue. It's not the same as a book report. It's not the same as a scientific journal. The point is that people actually enjoy the story. They enjoy the words that are read or spoken aloud. When you read a book, it's not the same as any other book you've read, mostly. The goal of reading is to enjoy what's there, not just to see what the point of the story is. Like, yes, stories can definitely have messages. They can have messages like, don't judge a book by its cover. It's hard to fit in. Keep trying even when you fail, and eventually you'll gain enough experience to succeed. We can get these sort of lessons from books, yes, but sometimes someone can read a story and actually just enjoy the story without the message. Sometimes reading about a kid who's new at a school, who gets the courage up to actually start talking and making friends. Sure, there might be a message in the story about, hey, if you're feeling alone, the best thing you can do is talk to more people because you never know who's going to be friendly. Sure, that might be the message. But maybe people just enjoy reading about someone else overcoming their issues without trying to find a message in it that applies to their life. And that was the point of new criticism. The work itself is important, and you have to look at what's actually in there, not just what the author is saying or what the story is saying. All righty, let's see. Okay, now I'm gonna suggest another break here just because we're about to get into the different modernist poets, and we're gonna get into a couple writers as well. So there's several of these. We're finally getting into the reading selections, and even though they are short, I know that this has been like, a pretty big chunk of the lesson. So if you haven't taken a break all the way up until this point, at least we've gone through the different schools of modernism. This is a good halfway point in the lesson before we actually start talking about poets and what they wrote. Okay. All right. We are on slide 21. We're basically through the first section of the lesson and we're getting to the last section. So we're going to start with modernist poets. So just to give you a heads up, we're working on 2 poets and I think 2 writers. What do my notes say? Yes, 2 poets and 2 writers. So the first poet that we get here is D.H. Lawrence, and I'm going to try to condense this as much as possible. He was born in Nottinghamshire, England, and he's pretty much better known for his novels than his poems. His most notable novel is Lady Chatterley's Lover, but he also wrote poems, essays, and short stories. That's pretty much all they tell you in this first paragraph here. And moving on, his work was considered radical. And the reason why this is he criticized a lot. Some of his works were even censored for their scathing critiques of modern society. So he critiqued society, which can be kind of offensive if people are happy with the way that they're living. So he was considered radical in some ways. His personal life also had some controversy. His wife was allegedly, it was rumored, pro-German, and that made him unpopular, and they ended up having to leave England, actually. So the rest of this is just information about his life. He traveled, trying to find a place to live. And let's see, on slide 22, they give you an example of his poetry. His poems are clear, concise, and frequently cynical. So we already talked about him criticizing a lot. He often used his works to express his disgust at the hypocrisy of mainstream society. And another common theme in his work is the celebration of the instincts and impulses of humankind. So this is kind of like the science influence here. He thought that human bodies and their instincts were wiser and more beautiful than any intelligence gained from education. So he was a trust your body, trust your instincts sort of guy. And it's said that some of his poems exhibit an almost romantic attitude towards nature. Some of his best known poems explore the secret inner life of plants and animals. So they give you an example of one of his poems, Nothing to Save. It's reflective of modernism in general and Lawrence's unique perspective on his own modern life. So this is just like kind of everything we just talked about rolled together as an example. So this poem is called Nothing to Save. There is nothing to save. Now all is lost, but a tiny core of stillness in the heart like the eye of a violet. So there's the example, and the excerpt that they give you for his works is, and oh, that the man I am might cease to be. So take a moment to read that poem, and then you can meet me on slide 23, and we'll get to the second poet. All right, so the second poet here is W.B. Yeats. His full name is William Butler Yeats, and he was born in Dublin, Ireland. And he spent his childhood in Ireland and England. He was involved with the Celtic Revival, which is a movement against English rule and culture in Ireland. And he served as a senator for the Irish Free State during the 1920s. And his work often reflects his pride in Irish mythology and folklore. At the same time, it exhibits a resigned pessimism or negativity towards the future of his native country. So he was fighting for a lot in Ireland, but he didn't think that things would turn out positively. He influenced many schools of modernist thought. I'm sorry, he was influenced by many schools of modernist thought, and he admired Ezra Pound and other imagists, and he also admired people in the symbolist movement. So he basically shows that in his poems. Many of his poems display the economy of language and vivid imagery that's characteristic of modernist poets. But an important thing to note about him is that despite his influences, Yeats' poems are largely traditional in structure. They are not freeform style. And then the last thing they tell you is that he won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1923. So the excerpt that they give you, the poem that they give you for the reading selection, is Easter 1916. And it's a reaction to the Easter Rising of Irish nationalists in 1916. So basically there was an uprising in Ireland. And after this uprising, the British ended up executing the leaders of the rebellion because of all of the damage that they caused. Yeats began writing this poem a few weeks before executions and completed the poem a few months later. And it's important to note that this poem is historical and biographical, because he was actually there at the time that this was happening. He's writing about an event that's near and dear to his actual background. He experienced this. So it says Yeats gives just as a summary, he gives details of the leaders of the rising, most of whom he met, and he addresses two different life views in this poem. I'm going to pause here to give you guys a moment to actually look at the poem, Easter 1916. If you're one of those people who needs the analysis before you go in, I'll go over that in just a second. But I just wanted to give people a chance to pause, open it up if you're following along in your lesson, and just take a moment to read it. Please remember that it is actually important for you to read the excerpts that are listed here because there will be questions on it. And the analysis will tell you what the point of the poem was, but it won't actually give you an understanding of the words that are specifically used in it and how they fit together. So if you get a question about an excerpt from this poem and you haven't read it, you're still going to have a hard time answering that question, even if you look at the analysis. Okay, alrighty. So, he gives details of the leaders that he met, and then he addresses two life views. The first view is that life is a changing dynamic entity. And the second is that life is unchanging, much like a rock stuck in one spot. That is like a simile that he uses. So he identifies Ireland's freedom fighters as rocks fighting blindly for something in the past. So even though he's reflecting on this, and he does want freedom for Ireland, he recognizes that the type of thing that the people are fighting for are an ideal from the past that doesn't take into account how different the world is now. Because he talks about both of these stances, life changing, being dynamic, and unchanging, by basically saying, even though the Irish have been fighting for freedom for so long, they're not going to get it. In a way, it's unchanging. And it makes it hard to tell what his stance is on the Easter Rising, like what he thought individually as a person about it. You can't really tell through reading his poetry. In the first part of the poem, he commends and respects the martyrs who died for what they believe, because that's noble. Being willing to die for what you believe in, it means that you have conviction and that you're willing to follow through. However, his rock metaphor expresses his frustration with the leaders and their inability to recognize change. And this ambivalence is characteristic of modernist literature. So that sort of hopelessness, not knowing where to go, because things just seem bad all around, that's definitely a part of the mood of modernist poetry. We get a little more information on slide 25 and another excerpt. It says that Yeats, like many of his generation, was profoundly affected by World War I. So, of course he was. Everyone was at the time. Unfortunately, he knew many people who died and fought in the war. One of the excerpts, one of the reading selections, is going to be a poem that he wrote for his close friend, Major Robert Gregory, who was a pilot who fought and died in World War I. The poem is called "An Irish Airman Foresees His Death." Gregory, Yeats's friend, was a member of the aristocracy, and his mother, Lady Gregory, was a big supporter of the arts. So it just made sense to make this tribute to him in the form of a poem. And like many of Yeats's poems, An Irish Airman Foresees His Death is a blending of traditional and modernist elements. So take a moment to read this. And lastly, they talk about how Yeats influenced many other aspiring poets and writers and his attitude towards those people. So he wrote a poem that was about how he feels about other poems or poets that copy him. So it's called "To a Poet Who Would Have Me Praise Certain Bad Poets, Imitators of His and Mine." You say, as I have often given tongue in praise of what another said or sung, 'twere politic to do the like by these, but have you known a dog to praise his fleas? So he's basically calling his imitators fleas. Uh, Also, keep in mind that there's a rhyming scheme here, right? Tongue, sung, these, fleas. And that's part of the traditional element that he keeps in his poems. So that's just an example of how that stays in there for him. This is still short. It's still straight to the point. So it's definitely modernist, but there's still some of the traditional poetry elements in here. Alrighty. So now we're moving on to modernist writers. So we have T.S. Eliot, and T.S. Eliot stands for Thomas Stearns Eliot. So I'm going to try to go over his life story and hit the major points for you. He was born in 1888 in Missouri, but he moved to Great Britain at age 25, basically as an adult, and eventually just became a British citizen. He lived there for that long. He was friends with Ezra Pound, and Pound was the person who got him published. He helped Eliot publish the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock in the magazine Poetry in 1915. And it's the poem that pushed him into literary recognition. In 1917, he published a collection of other poems. So basically, Pound is the reason why Eliot was famous, by pushing him to actually get published. T.S. Eliot's Wasteland, which was published in 1922, is considered to be the single most influential piece of the 20th century. It was that important. It was that popular. It's a long poem that uses many cultural references to show a modern world in ruins that somehow retains beauty and meaning. So that sort of matched the sentiment that people had coming back from the war. So during the last 30 years of his life, he gained a nearly mythical reputation. Like T.S. Eliot is super popular. He's very, very popular. He's known for writing a lot of poems, for writing a lot of stories. And he even received the Nobel Peace Prize for Literature in 1948. Basically, he and Yeats were considered to be like the top writers at the time. So we're gonna go into the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, since that's what got him famous here. And then we get some information about this poem. It brought Eliot immediate acclaim and became a landmark of the modernist style. So the poem combines Victorian form and rhythm with a pessimistic worldview and an emphasis on self-examination, which is characteristic of modernism. So they're telling you he kind of viewed things negatively, and there was a lot of internal examination. So looking within himself and trying to learn something, which we established earlier on is a sign of modernism. The poem also opens with the epitaph from Dante's Inferno. So basically, excuse me, it opens with an allusion to Dante's Inferno, which is an older classical work about a man's journey through the circles of hell and figuring out what the nature of man is and trying to find himself as well. And the reason why this is included is to establish a parallel or something in common between hell and the streets of London. And another important thing here is that this poem is in second person POV. So it addresses and identifies you as he walks those streets, describing doubts and insecurities. The poem is full of allusions, so there's other ones. And Eliot references other poets, including Andrew Marvell and William Shakespeare. He also alludes to the Bible and Greek mythology. So keep your eyes peeled for those references, especially the Greek mythology and biblical stuff while you're reading through that. So take a moment to read that and then meet me at slide 29, and then we'll get to the second modernist writer and the last one. So we're almost done. We're in the home stretch. All righty. So our last writer is Elizabeth Jennings. She was born in Lincolnshire, England. And pretty much she published her poetry first in an anthology with other English poets. And she was part of a group that just called their style the movement. Jennings wasn't picked because she's big and famous. She's not really thought of as an innovator. She was just a writer that was following the trends at the time. But her poems are celebrated for their precision and clarity. So she uses very precise language, and she's a very good example of precise language. It says her most modernist characteristic is her concern with the small, overlooked, and set aside aspects of life, which is another modernist thing, focusing on the perspective of one person day to day. So the excerpt that you're going to read is called A Bird in the House. Now go ahead and take a moment, pause the video, read that. And then there's only really one paragraph describing this. It's pretty simple. So just take a moment to read it and come back. Alrighty. So it says here that in this poem, A Bird in the House, Jennings pretty much explores the nature of grief and loss, which is a big topic for the lost generation and modernists, and the significance of rituals that are related to death in light of her own experience. So how important it is to actually grieve and go through that process. She compares her response to death as an adult and her response to the death of her family's pet bird when she was a child. So she compares those things to see what's similar and what's different. And even though she used traditional forms in some of her other poems, this poem has a more modernist form. So the number of syllables are different from line to line, and there's no rhyme scheme. And the language is direct and simple. So this is just a good example of modernism. Okay, and that's it for this lesson. It was long, but very straight to the point, pretty much just information about the movements and examples of those, and that's it. There you go. So here's what we are going to do. Let me go ahead and stop sharing. Okay, so just to go over this was a lot of information just about the movements themselves and what is considered part of the modernist movement, what isn't. And it's just important to keep in mind that a lot of these are big concepts. So if you're having a hard time understanding them, try to take it section by section, the way that I did, just going through it, because all of these things are connected. So if you understand the beginning, it's a little easier to understand some of the middle parts. If you're having a hard time with the poems or with the slides, you can feel free to reach out to me or Kathy Bahovic, the other English tutor. We can go over the tutorial with you if this video wasn't enough, or if you're just having trouble with some of the words from the excerpts. So just let us know. If you have any quick questions, you can shoot an email over to english@atsedu.net. And other than that, I think that that's just about it for this lesson. So if you made it this far, little clap for yourself, pat on the back. This was a lot of information all at once. Yeah, just keep trucking. We're almost at the end of this course. You're almost there. Alrighty, this is Miss Amber signing off, and good luck with the rest of your English class.